The glass doors of the high-end car dealership slid open, and a man stepped inside. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit or designer shoes. His faded jeans were slightly wrinkled, his hoodie had seen better days, and his sneakers were scuffed. His presence didn't match the gleaming rows of luxury cars around him. The salesmen, dressed sharply in their tailored suits, exchanged smirks as they watched him walk in. One of them, a tall man with slicked-back hair, nudged his colleague. "Looks like someone got lost on their way to the bus stop." The man ignored them and ran his hand over the smooth, polished hood of a deep black luxury sedan. It was a car of power, of prestige, a car that spoke for itself. He had spent years working for moments like this. As he reached for the door handle, a voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir. These vehicles aren't exactly in your price range." The salesman, named Richard, folded his arms, barely hiding his amusement. The man turned slowly, meeting his gaze. His expression was calm, almost amused. "Oh, and how do you know what my price range is?" Richard let out a chuckle. "Let's just say we've been doing this for a long time. We can tell who's serious and who's just here to take pictures for Instagram." Across the showroom, another salesman had been watching. David, a younger man, had noticed something different about this customer. He saw the confidence in his posture, the way his fingers traced the car's surface, not with awe, but with familiarity. Ignoring the mocking laughter of his colleagues, David stepped forward. "Sir, would you like to take a look inside?" The man smiled. "I'd love to." And just like that, the test had begun. David pulled open the sleek car door, gesturing for the man to step inside. The leather seats gleamed under the soft showroom lights, the scent of luxury filling the air. The man slid into the driver's seat, running his fingers over the wheel as if he belonged there. Across the room, Richard and the other salesman watched with amusement. "Can you believe this?" Richard scoffed. "David's wasting his time. That guy can't even afford a used car, let alone this beauty." The man, seemingly unbothered, glanced at David. "Tell me about the engine." His voice was steady, his tone curious, but there was something underneath, something controlled, like he was testing the waters. David smiled, launching into an explanation. "This model has a 6.0-liter V12 engine, pushing 600 horsepower. It can hit 60 in just under 3 seconds. The man nodded thoughtfully. "And the suspension? How does it handle sharp turns?" David's brow furrowed. Most casual shoppers didn't ask about suspension. They asked about the color, the leather seats, the status. This man knew cars. Richard, growing impatient, walked over and leaned against the car, arms crossed. "Look, buddy, why don't you tell us what your budget actually is? Maybe we can find you something more reasonable." David shot him a sharp look, but the man just smiled. "What if I told you I wanted this one?" The room fell silent for a moment, then Richard burst out laughing. "Yeah, and I want a private jet. But I don't waste people's time pretending I can afford one." David's stomach turned. The arrogance in Richard's voice made his blood boil. He wanted to stop this, but he didn't outrank him. The man's expression remained unreadable. "Maybe you shouldn't judge a book by its cover," Richard smirked. "Maybe you should pick up a book on financial reality." David clenched his fists. He had no idea how badly Richard was about to regret those words. The man sat quietly in the driver's seat, his fingers lightly tapping the leather steering wheel. Richard was still smirking, his arms crossed as if he had already won some kind of game. The other salesmen chuckled under their breath, their amusement filling the air like an unspoken challenge. David, standing beside the car, felt his pulse quicken. Why did they always do this? Judging people by their clothes, their first impression, as if that was all there was to them. The man finally spoke, his voice calm. So, how does financing work here? Richard laughed again. Financing? Oh, no offense, buddy, but I doubt any bank would approve you for this. He turned to David. What do you think? Maybe he should check out our pre-owned section? David clenched his jaw. He hated how Richard treated people, but he knew speaking up would only make things worse. The man let out a small chuckle, his fingers still tapping rhythmically. No need for financing. Richard blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time. Excuse me? The man turned to David, completely ignoring Richard. How soon could this car be ready for purchase? If I wanted to take it home today. David hesitated, glancing at Richard, who let out an exaggerated sigh. Oh, this is rich. He gestured toward the door. Listen, pal. We get it. You wanted to see what it's like to sit in a real car. You had your fun. Now, let's not waste any more of our time. David felt a spark of anger rise in his chest. But before he could say anything, the man simply smiled. You're right. I've seen enough. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his hoodie, and glanced at David. You've been helpful. I appreciate that. David gave a tight smile. Anytime, sir. Richard rolled his eyes. Yeah. Next time, try coming in with a real budget. The man chuckled softly as he reached into his pocket. Richard had no idea what was coming next. He slowly pulled something from his pocket, a sleek black leather wallet, simple but elegant. He opened it casually, revealing a thick stack of crisp $100 bills. The air in the showroom shifted. Richard's smirk twitched, but he forced himself to keep laughing. Oh, you've got some cash? What, a couple $100? That won't even get you a test drive. The man didn't respond. Instead, he flipped through the stack, pulling out one bill at a time, counting aloud in a calm, steady voice. 1,000, 2,000, 3, 4. The laughter in the room started to fade. A couple of other employees, who had been watching from afar, stepped closer, their curiosity piqued. Richard's confident stance stiffened, his eyes darting between the man's face and the ever-growing pile of cash in his hands. David felt his stomach tighten. He knew something big was about to happen. The man finished counting and snapped the wallet shut. You were saying? Richard cleared his throat. Look, sir, this isn't exactly how we do business. I mean, cash is not always the best way to. Cash is always accepted. The man interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He turned back to David. I'd like to finalize the purchase. With you. David blinked. Wait, me? The man nodded. You're the only one here who treated me like a person. I don't do business with people who judge others by appearances. Richard's face turned red. Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The man cut him off with a raised hand. No misunderstanding. Just a test. The room fell silent. A test. The words echoed in Richard's mind. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. David swallowed hard. He passed the test. But he had no idea just how much this moment was about to change his life. David's heart pounded as he processed the man's words. A test? He glanced at Richard, whose smug expression had completely vanished. The once confident salesman now looked pale, his jaw tightening. The man placed the stack of cash neatly on the counter, his calm gaze unwavering. I don't believe in judging people by their clothes. I like to see how they treat others when they think they have nothing to gain. Richard swallowed hard. Sir, The man ignored him and turned back to David. Go ahead and start the paperwork. I'll pay in full. David hesitated, still trying to wrap his head around what was happening. Are you sure? The man chuckled. I wouldn't be standing here if I wasn't. The other employees, who had once been laughing along with Richard, now stood in stunned silence. They had made a huge mistake. Richard, still desperate to salvage the situation, stepped forward. Look, the man held up a hand. No need to explain. I saw everything I needed to see. He turned his gaze to Richard, and for the first time, his expression hardened. I don't do business with people who look down on others. David exhaled slowly and reached for the paperwork. His hands were slightly shaky, but he forced himself to focus. He had just won the biggest sale of his life. Richard, now completely humiliated, clenched his jaw and stormed off. The other salesman avoided eye contact, suddenly finding the floor incredibly interesting. The man looked back at David, a small smile on his lips. And after this, we're going to have another conversation. One that will change your life. David frowned, confused. What did he mean by that? He was about to find out. David sat at his desk, hands slightly trembling as he filled out the paperwork. He had made sales before, but nothing like this. A full cash payment on one of the most expensive cars in the showroom? This was unheard of. The mysterious man stood calmly, watching as David worked. Every so often, he glanced around the dealership, observing the nervous expressions of the other employees. They knew they had messed up. Richard, now sitting stiffly at his own desk, pretended to be busy, avoiding eye contact. The humiliation of being proven wrong was written all over his face. After a few minutes, David slid the papers forward. Just sign here, and it's officially yours. The man picked up the pen, his movements smooth and confident. He signed his name in bold, elegant strokes. For the first time, David saw it clearly. The name on the document was one he recognized. A name that didn't belong to an ordinary customer. David's breath caught in his throat. He had seen this name before, on the cover of financial magazines. He swallowed hard. You're him, aren't you? The man smiled. I was wondering how long it would take for you to figure it out. David felt his pulse quicken. He had just sold a car to one of the richest businessmen in the country. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. But before he could say anything, the man leaned forward slightly, his tone softer. Now, let's talk about your commission and what I plan to do next. David's heart pounded. What did he mean? What was coming next? David's fingers tightened around the paperwork as he stared at the signature. This wasn't just any customer. He was one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. A man whose empire stretched across multiple industries. His mouth felt dry as he looked up. I had no idea. The billionaire chuckled. That was the point. He tapped the side of the paperwork. You didn't judge me. You treated me with respect, even when everyone else laughed. That's why I chose you. Richard, who had been pretending to work at his desk, went rigid. His face paled. He now realized he had just humiliated a man with enough wealth to buy the entire dealership. The billionaire leaned forward slightly. David, do you know what the commission is on a sale like this? David swallowed hard. I think it's around 10%. The billionaire nodded. That's right. And that means today, you're walking away with a commission of nearly $50,000. David's breath hitched. 50,000. More money than he had ever seen at once. Money that could change his life. But the billionaire wasn't done. His expression softened as he looked at David more closely. I've done my research. I know about your daughter. David's stomach dropped. My daughter? The billionaire nodded. I know she's been battling cancer, and I know how expensive the treatments are. David's hands trembled slightly. He had been struggling for months, trying to keep up with the medical bills. He had lost sleep and worked extra hours. The billionaire reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black checkbook. "Consider this an investment in kindness." David could barely breathe as the man wrote a figure on the check. When he turned it around, David's vision blurred with tears. It was enough to pay for the entire treatment. The billionaire smiled. "Your daughter will have every chance to fight. And it's because you chose to be a good person." David's hands shook as he took the check. His throat tightened with emotion. He had spent so long believing that the world was cruel and unfair. But today, kindness had won, and his daughter would get another chance at life. David stared at the check in his trembling hands, his mind racing. Was this real? Could this actually be happening? He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the moisture clouding his vision. The billionaire smiled, his eyes filled with something David hadn't expected, genuine warmth. "This is not charity," he said softly. "This is a reward for the way you chose to treat another human being." David swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you." The billionaire chuckled. "You already did. When you treated me with respect, expecting nothing in return." He gestured toward the check. "Now, use it well. Give your daughter the future she deserves." David's knees nearly buckled. He had spent so many nights praying for a miracle, and now one had walked into his life. He thought of his little girl, lying in her hospital bed, smiling through the pain, unaware of how close they were to losing everything. Richard, who had been watching silently, finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." The billionaire turned to him, his expression unreadable. "That's the problem. You never know who you're speaking to. You judge based on appearances. But character? Character reveals itself in moments like these." Richard's face burned with shame. The other employees avoided his gaze, suddenly finding their desks incredibly interesting. They had laughed, mocked, and now they were witnessing a moment they would never forget. David looked at the billionaire, his hands still shaking. "I promise, I will never take this for granted." The billionaire's smile widened. "I know you won't. That's why I chose you." For the first time in a long while, David felt something he had nearly forgotten: hope. And in that moment, he knew his life would never be the same again. The dealership was silent. The once lively showroom, filled with arrogance and judgment, now felt like a courtroom where justice had just been served. The billionaire stood tall, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. David clutched the check, his heart still pounding. This wasn't just money. This was his daughter's second chance at life. The weight of it pressed against his chest, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel crushed by it. The billionaire turned to the stunned employees. "Every one of you witnessed this moment. Let this be a lesson." His voice was steady, yet firm. "You never know who is standing in front of you. You never know their story. And yet, some of you chose to judge me without knowing a thing about me." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, The billionaire raised a hand. "No excuses." He turned his gaze to the other salespeople. "Tell me, how many of you ignored me when I walked in? How many of you assumed I was beneath your time?" No one spoke. They all knew the answer. David watched as Richard clenched his jaw, his once unshakable confidence completely shattered. The billionaire let the silence hang before speaking again. "David was the only one who passed my test." He didn't see a man in old clothes. He saw a customer, a person. Richard lowered his head, swallowing hard. The billionaire stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. This dealership will hear from me soon. I have no interest in doing business with people who lack integrity." David's eyes widened. The consequences were about to be real. The billionaire turned back to him, his expression softening. "As for you, David, I have one last question." David straightened. "Yes, sir." The billionaire smiled. "What are your dreams beyond this place?" David blinked. His dreams? No one had asked him that in years, and he had a feeling that his answer was about to change his future forever. David stood frozen, the billionaire's question echoing in his mind. His dreams? It had been so long since he allowed himself to think about them. He swallowed hard. I always wanted to start my own business. Something that truly helps people." His voice was hesitant, unsure. The billionaire nodded thoughtfully. "And what's stopping you?" David let out a soft chuckle, glancing down at the check still clutched in his hand. "Money. Responsibility. Fear, maybe." The billionaire smiled. "Fear is temporary. Regret lasts forever." He paused, then said, "What if I told you I could help you start that business?" David's breath caught. You would do that?" The billionaire chuckled. "I invest in people, David, and I see something in you. Integrity, kindness, resilience. Those qualities are rarer than money, and they're worth investing in." Richard, who had been silently watching, now looked like he wanted to disappear. The very man he had mocked was now offering David an opportunity beyond anything he could ever dream of. David's hands shook slightly. This wasn't just a gift, it was a new path. The billionaire continued, "Take some time to think about it. But if you're willing, I'd like to personally mentor you. Not just give you money, but teach you how to turn it into something greater." David's mind raced. A chance to build something of his own? To provide for his family without struggling paycheck to paycheck? His heart pounded as he realized this could be the beginning of an entirely new life. And for the first time in years, he felt excited about the future. David sat in his small apartment that night, staring at the check in his hands. The digits seemed unreal, almost like they belonged to someone else's life. His daughter slept peacefully in the next room, unaware of how drastically their world had shifted in a single day. His mind raced. A business of his own? A mentor like that? Was this even real? He had spent so long just trying to survive that the idea of something bigger felt impossible. His wife, Emily, sat beside him, her eyes filled with quiet concern. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. David let out a breath. "I'm thinking, this might be the opportunity we've been waiting for." She studied him for a long moment before reaching for his hand. "Then take it." He looked at her, surprised. "Just like that?" She smiled. "David, you have worked harder than anyone I know. If someone like him believes in you, maybe it's time you believe in yourself too." A lump formed in his throat. She was right. The next morning, David walked into the dealership one last time. The billionaire was already there, standing near the same car he had purchased. He turned as David approached, raising an eyebrow. "Well?" David swallowed hard, then met his gaze with determination. "I'm in." The billionaire's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Good." Richard, watching from a distance, paled. David wasn't just leaving the dealership. He was stepping into an entirely new world. And for the first time in his life, David felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. David stood in the billionaire's sleek, high-rise office, the city skyline stretching endlessly behind them. The luxury of the space was overwhelming. Polished mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling windows, and walls lined with awards and framed newspaper headlines about the man who had changed his life overnight. The billionaire sat across from him, his hands folded on the desk. "Tell me, David, what do you know about running a business?" David swallowed hard. "Not much, to be honest. I've always just worked hard and tried to provide." The billionaire smiled. "That's a good start. But hard work alone won't make you wealthy. It's about working smart." He leaned back, watching David closely. "Are you willing to learn?" David nodded without hesitation. "Yes, whatever it takes." The billionaire chuckled. "Good answer." He slid a thick folder across the desk. "Inside this is everything you need to get started. Your new business." David's breath caught as he opened the folder. It was real. Paperwork, licensing documents, investment plans. This wasn't just a vague promise. This was happening. "I've set up an initial investment. The rest will be up to you," the billionaire continued. "But I believe in you, David. You've already proven that integrity is at your core. That's more valuable than money." David's hands tightened around the folder. He had never been handed an opportunity like this before. It was terrifying, but exhilarating. The billionaire stood up and extended his hand. "Welcome to the next chapter of your life." David took a deep breath and shook his hand, a surge of energy rushing through him. This was it, the moment that would define his future. For the first time, he wasn't just an employee. He was about to become a leader. The next morning, David walked into his new office, a modest but modern space, freshly furnished and waiting for him to take charge. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, but for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a challenge. Stacks of documents, emails from potential clients, and an eager assistant waiting for instructions. All of it reminded him that this wasn't just a dream anymore. This was real. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. The billionaire stepped inside, his sharp gaze scanning the room. "How does it feel?" David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Overwhelming, but exciting." The billionaire nodded. "Good. That means you care." He studied David for a moment before continuing. "I need to see if you're truly ready for this. There's one more test." David straightened. "Another test?" The billionaire pulled out a folder and placed it on the desk. "Inside this file is a business deal, one that could make you a lot of money. But it comes with a cost. You'll have to cut corners, compromise your ethics, and put profit over people." David frowned. "You want me to take the deal?" The billionaire smirked. "I want to see what kind of businessman you really are." David hesitated. The offer was lucrative, almost too good to be true. But then he remembered why he was here. Integrity, kindness, the very things that got him this opportunity in the first place. Slowly, he closed the folder and slid it back. "I appreciate the offer, but if I have to hurt people to make money, then I'd rather find another way." The billionaire's smirk widened. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear." David let out a breath, relief washing over him. He had just passed the final test. The billionaire extended his hand. "Now, let's build something that truly matters." And at that moment, David knew he wasn't just an employee anymore. He was a businessman. The days that followed were unlike anything David had ever experienced. Early mornings, late nights, and an endless stream of decisions that would determine the future of his new business. But he thrived under the pressure. For the first time, he wasn't just working to survive. He was building something of his own. The billionaire stayed close, offering guidance but never making choices for him. "A real leader learns by doing," he had said. And David took that lesson to heart. One afternoon, as David was finalizing a contract, he received a call. It was from the hospital. His daughter's final round of treatment had been scheduled, fully covered thanks to the billionaire's help. Tears burned his eyes. This wasn't just about money. This was about the chance to watch his daughter grow up, to give her the life she deserved. Later that evening, he met the billionaire for dinner. As they sat in a quiet corner of an upscale restaurant, David took a deep breath. "I don't know how to thank you," the billionaire smirked. "Then don't. Just promise me one thing." David leaned in. "Anything. When you're in my position one day, pass it forward." David's chest tightened. He knew what that meant. One day, it would be his turn to change someone else's life. He nodded. "I will." Months passed, and David's life transformed in ways he never imagined. His business flourished, built on integrity, hard work, and the lessons he had learned from the billionaire. He was no longer just a salesman. He was a leader, a provider, a man with a future. His daughter's treatment had been a success. Seeing her run around the park, laughing without pain, brought tears to his eyes every time. This was the life he had dreamed of, but never believed he could have. One day, as David was leaving his office, he noticed a young man standing outside hesitantly. His clothes were worn, his hands fidgeting nervously. He looked exactly like David had felt all those years ago. Uncertain, overlooked, desperate for a chance. David stepped forward. "Can I help you?" The young man looked up, startled. I was just looking for a job, but I don't think I belong in a place like this." David smiled. He knew those words. He had lived them. "Tell me about yourself." The young man hesitated. "There's not much to tell. I work hard, but I don't have experience. No one ever gives me a chance." David's smile widened. He saw himself in this kid, and he knew exactly what to do. "Come inside," he said, opening the door. "Let's change that." The young man followed David into the office, his nervous steps hesitant but filled with hope. This was more than just a job interview. It was the beginning of something bigger. David gestured for him to sit, then leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Tell me, why do you want to work here?" The young man swallowed hard. I need a chance. I know I don't have the right experience, but I'll work harder than anyone else if someone just believes in me." David's heart clenched. Those were the same words he had once thought, the same desperation he had once felt. He nodded slowly. "Let me tell you a story." And so, he did. He told the young man about the day a billionaire walked into his dealership dressed in old clothes, about the arrogance and judgment of others, about the test he unknowingly passed. He spoke about the offer that changed his life, the lessons he learned, and the opportunity that had led him here. The young man listened, his eyes wide. "That's incredible," he whispered. David smiled. "You remind me of myself. And if someone hadn't believed in me, I wouldn't be sitting here today. So, I'm going to do the same for you." Tears welled in the young man's eyes. "You mean, I got the job?" David extended his hand. "Welcome to the team." As their hands met, David felt something deep inside him shift. He had come full circle. The billionaire's words echoed in his mind. "When you're in my position one day, pass it forward." And now, he had.